Hello everyone, before this video starts, I would appreciate if you guys would leave a like and subscribe, since your support means the world to me and allows me to make these types of videos. Now let's get into the video. There is no official record of the exorcism we performed at 1237 Palmer Avenue in Los Angeles last November. The church encourages us not to speak to the press about such things anyway, as our work tends to be sensationalized. In truth, most cases we investigate aren't possessions at all, just ordinary, tragic mental health issues wearing the trappings of religion. I was still only a year into my apprenticeship back then. Up to that point, even in the few instances when I'd witnessed a genuine possession, the process of exorcism was far more mundane than the movies would have you believe. My mentor, Father Anthony, would simply follow the protocols as outlined by the Holy See, sprinkling with holy water, laying of hands and exsufflation, along with the recitation of the prescribed prayers. Only once had I seen the basic prayers fail. It was a case where the entity within an elderly woman had been allowed to fester, possibly as long as 5 years. The family had spent half a decade ignoring the problem, ascribing it to ordinary dementia, even as her behavior grew worse and worse. We had been called in after she'd twisted the head off a beloved family cat, all while invoking the names of minor demons she had no business knowing. Even then, Father Anthony had been able to remove the demon in less than a week, relying on the prayer to Saint Michael and a silver cross that had once belonged to Pope Leo XIII. Nothing could have prepared either of us for what we found on Palmer Avenue. We were sent there at the behest of Father Felipe, a parish priest who noticed that Maya Knowles, one of the young women attending his church, had missed several weeks of Sunday Mass. It's unfortunately common for young people to fall out of love with the faith, but it raised a small flag for the Father Felipe, who caught up with her mother, Sharon, one day after Mass to ask her if anything was wrong. Sharon immediately burst into tears, confessing that her previously bright, cheerful daughter had become a recluse overnight, refusing to leave her room. Again, such things happen, but it aroused the Father Felipe's interest, and he paid the family a visit a few days later. What he witnessed upon entering the girl's room was enough to make him call us immediately. Rather than paraphrase, I'll include a transcription of the voicemail he left here. There was a foul smell. It hit you all the way down the hall. Some kind of cocktail of sweat and excrement. It grew more powerful as I approached Maya's room, such that I was hesitant to enter. At the doorway, I hesitated. That's when I heard the awful growling, like an animal's stomach left empty far too long. Nothing about it sounded the least bit human. I said a prayer and entered. The girl, and I almost hesitate to call her that now, had been beautiful when I last saw her. So much so that she'd been the subject of several confessions from teenage boys in the parish, all unable to take their eyes off of her. Adult men, too. Her mother had been pushing her toward a career in modeling, television, something I warned them both about: pride. The dangers of the superficial. Of course, I'm a priest in LA. I have many such conversations. I will say that Maya's mother was particularly obsessed with her daughter's career in a way that gave me pause. But I felt that if I confronted her too harshly about the subject, I might push her away from the faith entirely. When I walked into the room, I had to suppress my urge to vomit. Maya lay in a bed in the center of the dark bedroom. Something, its texture uneven and smudged with fingerprints, had been rubbed and dried over the windows, blocking out the light. Despite the near dark, I could just make out Maya's skeletal form, her skin clinging like tissue to her bones, exposing every crease. The growling sound was emanating from her stomach and upper throat, the low pitch more like the death row of some great beast than a teenage girl. There was a scratching sound filling the room too, and when I looked closer, I realized that she was weakly moving her arm, grabbing handfuls of dry rice from a 50-pound bag by her side. She moved her hand to her lips, eating the dry rice whole before going back for another handful. Looking around by her bedside, I saw at least 6 or 7 similar bags littered on the floor. "Like what you see?" she asked me. Of course not. I'm not exactly your type, am I? Couldn't get hard for a girl like me if you tried. Maybe worth a shot, though. Why don't you come a little closer? Give me a little kiss. I knew in that moment that I was in mortal danger. Behind me, the door began to close on its own accord, and as I reached back to stop it, it slammed shut. I heard the crunch of bone as my fingers smashed in the doorframe. The break was bad enough that I could see the white of my bone through the skin, and I was bleeding profusely. Suddenly, the girl was up. Without a sound, she'd moved to the foot of the bed, her legs no thicker than pool cues dangling over the side. "You smell amazing, Father," she said. She stood and her posture was bent, unnatural. One of her knees seemed to bend the opposite way. One of her arms seemed to have broken in so many places that it flapped like a tentacle. With my good hand, I pulled the door open as hard as I could, trying to free my limp fingers and escape before she could reach me. She stepped deliberately. I sensed that she could move faster if she desired, but she enjoyed watching me squirm. Almost without thinking, I began to recite a Hail Mary, in the original Latin, something that has always brought me peace. As the words exited my mouth, I could tell that Maya was bothered, even taking a small step back. "Shut up," she was muttering. "Shut up about that bitch." But I refused to stop, and as I did, I was able to pry the door open a little at a time. Then all at once, Maya was screaming, commanding me to close my mouth. Suddenly, the door flew open and I stumbled through, shutting it behind me as fast as I could. After that, there was only silence. No one has heard a thing from inside the room since then. I have instructed Maya's mother to avoid going inside at all costs. We need help, desperately. A strange look had crossed Father Anthony's face after he heard the message. He went to consult a few old books in his personal library as I listened to the message on repeat, trying to sift through the details. "How bad is it?" I asked when he returned. "It is what it is," he said. "The protocols are clear. We go, we evaluate. Should it turn out to be a major exorcism, we will use the prayer to St. Michael for as long as it takes. Pack your large suitcase. It may be a while." "Father," I asked, "has the prayer ever failed to remove the entity?" He shook his head. "Demons are cowards by nature. With some luck, within a few weeks it will flee, just as its brethren have before." Father Anthony and I were different in our faith. Mine was almost like romance, swelling one day and waning the next, ever present but varying vastly depending on my mood. His was steady. To Father Anthony, the universe was perfectly ordered, bound by immutable laws. To him, the prayers always worked. Just as one pool ball colliding with another would predictably transfer its force, so too would his prayers send demons reeling. "You look worried," he said as I played the message again. "Don't. It's unseemly for a man of the cloth. Pack your bag. By now you should know that time is critical." Though he was almost steady as always, I noticed a slight tick as he spoke, like his mouth couldn't stop twitching. Looking down, I saw he was carrying a small pouch of red velvet that I'd never seen before. "Just a precaution," he said. "Hopefully something we don't need until much further into your training." I never expected to become an exorcist. My family wasn't even Catholic growing up. My parents were hippie types, mercurial in their beliefs. For a while, we attended a Baptist church. Then, just as I'd finally learned all of the lyrics to the hymns, we moved 2 towns away, where my mom got swept up in the Kabbalah and tried to drag us all into it with her. Before I was a teenager, I'd spent a day or two in a mosque, a Swinomish smokehouse, and a Gnostic temple. It was my wife, Sophia, who brought me into the faith. She had grown up in a big Italian-American family in New York, and for her, Catholicism was the same as family. I converted to marry her. All it took was a few months of classes and a ceremony on Easter. I didn't even ask myself if I believed in God. It was enough to believe in Sophia. She was a true believer in the best sense of the word, generous to a fault, always exhausting herself trying to keep us all happy. All year she sewed quilts, using them as Christmas presents or baby shower gifts. Several times she tried to teach me how to sew, but I was hopeless, clumsy. She loved me anyway. Then one Thanksgiving, after staying up far too late drinking wine and prepping vegetables, she woke up and decided to run to the store for pre-made dinner rolls. It was icy. She wasn't even speeding, but it didn't matter. She skidded into oncoming traffic at the wrong time. She died instantly. After she was gone, none of my usual crutches dulled the pain. Alcohol, throwing myself into work, exercise, it all felt hollow, insufficient to replace Sophia. We held a funeral mass shortly after she died, and it was the first time I felt an ounce of peace. The light streaming in from the stained-glass windows suddenly seemed different to me, as if heaven were actually on the other side if I could just step through them. I found myself going to church more often after that. Not just on Sundays, but on weekdays too, right after work. I'd watch the darkening sky through the stained glass as I knelt in one of the back pews, and for a short time I felt like Sophia wasn't so far away. Eventually, the priest there, Father Ignatius, would gently tell me that it was well past closing time, and I would leave. Until one day, he asked me to come with him. "I wonder if you'd consider joining the priesthood," he said. "Some widowers do?" I laughed. "I'm barely Catholic," I said. "I just joined for her." He shook his head. "I don't believe you." The house at 1237 Palmer Avenue was decadent, even by LA standards. Set back on a nearly full-acre lot bordered by a tall stucco wall, the house soured up 3 stories, all elegant metal and glass. Later, we would learn that the girl's father had paid well over $1 million for the architect alone before construction ever started. As we approached, we noted that one bedroom where the lights shone brown-red through a darkened window. Reflexively, we both made the sign of the cross. Sitting on the front steps, we met Father Felipe, who was half asleep, slumped against the rail. Though he couldn't have been much older than 30, his skin appeared sallow, his eyes ringed like a cold, distant planet. His hand was wrapped in a thick bandage crusted with blood. "Father Anthony! Father Matthew!" He reached out, his hand shaking, before breaking down in sobs. I could tell Father Anthony was unsettled at this greeting. "You have done your part now, Father Felipe," I said. "You should go back to your church. Pray, rest." Father Felipe shook his head. "I won't leave until we've seen this through," he said. "I made a promise to myself." Father Anthony shook his head. "That's merely pride whispering in your ear," he said. "Please, go." Father Felipe reached down into his pocket and found a piece of candy. He popped it into his mouth. His breath was rank, and I wondered how long it had been since he last brushed his teeth. "I'll just wait a little longer," he said, "just until you've had a chance to go in." I could tell Father Anthony wasn't happy about this, but he was eager to go in and get to work. We brushed past Father Felipe, who fell back into a ball on the steps, and we walked to the door. Father Anthony rang the doorbell once, then waited patiently. After perhaps 15 seconds, he scowled and rang it again. "Mrs. Knowles," he called, but there was no response. Then, finally, he turned the knob and we entered. Immediately, the stench hit us both. The house smelled as if the walls around us would burst, sending a flood of excrement down to cover our feet. Father Anthony raised a handkerchief to his nose, passing another to me so that I could do the same. Again, he called for Mrs. Knowles, but there was no response. Somewhere, up above, we heard a skittering sound, knocks on the wood, like someone on stilts running through the hall. Father Anthony fumbled in his pocket, removing his silver cross. He began to wave it ever so slightly back and forth, like a hypnotist's pendulum, as he recited a Hail Mary. "Mrs. Knowles!" I shouted, and the thumping sound stopped. "She's in the kitchen," said a voice that made my heart nearly stop. It was deep and resonant and seemed to speak from all around us. Father Anthony gestured for me to go to the kitchen. "You find the mother, I'll go up to talk to the girl," he said. He had removed the red velvet bag from his pocket and was loosening its drawstring. "Maybe we should call for assistance," I said, but he shook his head. "If we follow the rites, we will prevail. Remember, God is on our side. Go find the mother and get her out of the house. Hurry!" Without another word, he headed up the stairs. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, almost running. Then as I reached the archway separating the rooms, I stopped and vomited, barely able to comprehend what I was seeing. There in the kitchen lay Mrs. Knowles, or rather, what was left of her. In the center of the room lay a pile of bloody broken bones, all stacked in a messy pile and topped with a broken skull, matted in blonde hair. Most of her, the flesh, the organs, the brain and muscle, the fat, was all gone. Time may have passed. I can't be sure. My vision seemed to go black and then red. Strangely, I found myself oddly hungry, so much so that I nearly opened the refrigerator to look for something to eat. Then I heard a scream from upstairs, and my senses came back to me. I ran through the hall and up the staircase, 2 steps at a time. It was clearly Father Anthony screaming, his cries mixed with the prayer to Saint Michael. Thy thousand hosts are spread, embattled o'er the azure sky. But Michael bears thy standard dread, and lifts the might cross on high. The prayer was punctuated with repeated shrieks, both from him and someone else. I ran down the hallway toward Maya's room, the rank smell growing so thick it seemed to thicken the very air. In the room I found them. They were coiled together like 2 pythons, both trying to strangle the other. Blood was everywhere, flowing freely from wounds on both of their bodies. Somehow, in the few minutes since we'd parted ways, Anthony had managed to lose both legs and his left arm, all bitten down to the nubs. Another long gash had opened his belly, and his guts were hanging out of him. With his one good arm, he was holding something gleaming up to Maya's face. Through the hazy air and the blood, it took me a few seconds to recognize it as a needle and silver thread. Somehow he had managed to apply 3 or 4 stitches across the girl's mouth, sealing it almost shut. Now, even as he tried to apply a 4th stitch, she bit at his fingers with the side of her mouth, severing the pinky and chewing it with obvious joy. Father Michael cried out but continued the prayer. He and that sign, the rebel powers, did with their dragon prince expel and hurled them from the heaven's high towers down like a thunderbolt to hell. Every part of me wanted to run. If I'm being honest, I wanted to tear my collar and robes from my body and sprint into the LA night, never looking back. But something in me refused. Instead, I sprang forward, taking the shaking needle from Father Anthony's shaking fingers. I did everything right, he said weakly. And then the light in his eyes went out. Maya turned her attention to me now, trying to bite me, shouting curses. Run, 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 little assistant. You're in over your head. I stared at the silver thread dangling from her mouth. I'd never even heard of such a thing. There were rules, protocols that I'd never even heard of, that I wasn't ready for. The girl smiled, pulling at the thread, beginning to unravel Father Anthony's careful work. I saw now that she would open her mouth wide and eat me down to the very bone, that I would scream while she chewed up my lungs and heart. Indeed, she was reaching for Anthony's guts now, slurping his intestines through the small hole still left on the side of her mouth. Except that I wasn't seeing any of that now. I was in a quiet room with Sophia, sitting side by side. On ours laps was a quilt. She was smiling, the light catching the strands of her light brown hair. I can't do it, I was saying, fumbling with the needle. Of course you can, she said. It's not science. It's just in and out. In and out. We know you're good at that. I blushed, the needle slipping out from between my fingers. Just relax, she said. Here, let me guide you. She put her hand on mine, her flesh warm and soft. Slowly, she guided my fingers down through the soft white fabric. Then suddenly I was back. I watched my fingers slip the silver thread through Maya's lips. Only a crack at the side of her mouth remained exposed. You're different than them, she said. Her words more muffled now, and it almost sounded like a normal girl's voice. You carry someone with you who... I used the moment of surprise to apply the final stitch, blood pooling around the thread as I cinched it shut, silencing her forever. As soon as it was done, she fell back in the bed, her eyes closing as sleep took her. After a while, after I'd gotten my thoughts together, I called Father Anthony's superior at the Vatican to explain what had happened. I tried to stay calm, to explain things as accurately as possible, but I'm sure my voice was shaking. Around me, the worst of the stench was gone, though ordinary one's blood, bile persisted. Still, the air was that much cleaner than before, and I found I was able to breathe. I expected him to doubt my story, but he just listened without saying anything. Then finally, as I reached the end of what I had to say, he spoke. You were able to apply the stitches yourself? Just the last couple. Father Anthony did most of the work. He paused for a moment. Did you have any other outside help? I thought about that for a second, about Sophia. Maybe. You did well, he said. We will send people, for both you and the girl. They will bring you back here. To the Vatican? Is that the protocol? There was a brief pause. Father Anthony was a firm believer in protocol. Are you? No, I said after a moment. Good, he said. Then we will have much to discuss when you arrive. For an hour, maybe two, after I called the Vatican, I sat on the front steps of the house staring into space. Father Felipe was nowhere to be seen. I figured that was for the best. He'd probably taken Father Anthony's advice and run back to his church. With any luck, he was sleeping. I sat shaking on the steps. I reeked of blood and worse. Of course, I thought through the horror I just witnessed. The thick air, the smell of exposed guts, the glee on Maya's face as she slurped up Father Anthony's intestines. But that wasn't what dominated my thoughts. I'd seen her, Sophia, just as clearly as if she were still alive, warm and sitting beside me, teaching me to sew. Without question, she had been there. She had saved me, and so I must have made an odd sight when the priest sent by the Vatican arrived. I sat there covered in several people's blood, including my own, my fingers bleeding from my clumsy needlework, smiling like I'd just seen God himself. So good to find you well, Father Matthew, said a tall, muscular priest with a thick gray beard. I'm Father Thomas. This is my trainee, Father Anselmo. He gestured to a rail-thin, bald man with angular features beside him. I thought I knew all of the exorcists working in the States, I said, still half-dazed. He shook his head. We are not ordinary exorcists, he explained. We belong to a particular order where discretion is of utmost importance. Still, we know rumors of our existence circulate. Perhaps you've heard of the Knights of St. Michael? I shook my head. Good, he said. We are only called upon in cases requiring certain non-traditional skills. Based on your call, the Vatican believes this may be one such case. Father Anselmo shot him a look, and I recognized it immediately. It was one I'd given Father Anthony a dozen times when we arrived at the home of some poor girl claiming to be possessed but really just needed a few years of therapy, maybe some antipsychotic meds. What? I asked. You don't believe me? What I saw. We're certain you saw something, said Father Tomas. Whether you performed a common exorcism or encountered something greater remains in question. Look at my fucking clothes, I shouted, staggering to my feet. Look at the blood on my hands. Smell me. Don't you smell it? That's when I looked down at myself and realized I was clean. Not even a drop of blood decorated my robes. The only evidence of my encounter was a small scab on my index finger from where I'd pricked myself with the needle as I sewed Maya's mouth shut. I looked back at the house. Even the dark-smeared window was clean now, with a gentle light shining out. Without another word, I ran back up the steps and opened the door. Inside, the house was pristine, almost unnaturally so. The blood was gone. The stink, too. Somewhere, a vanilla candle was burning. Gentle music played on the speakers overhead. The girl, I said to no one in particular. And now I was running up the stairs 2 at a time again. I ran down the hall and burst into her room, half expecting to find her hanging from the ceiling by her feet, a mass of skin and sinew hanging from her mouth. Instead, I found her lying still, almost death-like in bed. She wore a spotless white dress, and her hair fell about her head on the pillow, as if perfectly arranged strand by strand. She was beautiful now, no longer the creature of paper and bones I'd encountered hours earlier. The only evidence that anything had happened was the silver thread still in place, sealing her mouth shut. I heard the other priests approaching from behind me. None of this is right, I said. None of it was this way. I believe you, said Father Thomas, putting a hand on my shoulder. We have seen stranger things. The devil can be exceptionally tidy when he chooses to be. Or could it be that Father Matthew elected to perform a wholly unnecessary surgery, said Father Anselmo, gesturing to the girl's lips. We can pray that such is the case, for her sake, said Father Tomas. In the meantime, we will proceed as if this is a true lieutenant of hell, likely of the third circle. I gave him a look. There were no such things as circles of hell in the canon. Gluttony? Asked Father Anselmo, incredulous. I thought they were supposed to be fat. Father Thomas shook his head. Remember your Aquinas, he said. Gluttony takes 5 forms. Laute, too luxurious. Studios, too elaborate. Nimis, too large a quantity. Prepropere, eating at the wrong time. Ardenter, eating too fast. A glutton may be any size. I could tell Father Anselmo wanted to argue, but he was the trainee after all, and it wasn't becoming to argue, especially in front of a stranger. He bit his tongue. Very well then, said Father Thomas. Then we shall proceed. Prepare bindings of cloth soaked in holy water. Wrap her once at the shoulders, once at the wrists, once at the ankles. Father Matthew, if you are feeling up to the task, another set of hands would be useful, especially since time can be a factor in some cases. We will want to get her back to the Vatican as soon as possible, before... As he spoke, I saw a hint of movement coming from the girl's direction. Glancing over, I saw something thick and black peek its head from between the 2 middle stitches of the mouth where the gap was greatest. It could have been a worm, a tongue, a snake, a centipede. Before I could get a good look, it pulled back inside. I helped Father Anselmo prepare the bindings, though I could tell he would have rather done the job himself. They'd brought holy water in some kind of red-brown earthenware jar that I hadn't seen before. We soaked 3 long strips of cloth and bound the girl, who didn't stir once. Though I had never heard of such a protocol before, the process made sense. 3 bindings representing the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit uniting to bind the demon. 2 hours later, we were on a private plane bound for Rome. The aircraft was luxurious by any standard, with plush white leather chairs emblazoned with the flaming sword of Saint Michael in delicate black embroidery. 2 pilots sat up front through a security door that looked extra thick. They'd made a point of letting me know they were both well armed. Of course, I wondered why such levels of protection were necessary, but I just nodded as if this was all perfectly normal. Enjoying the accommodations? Asked Father Anselmo. Father Tomas had drifted off at takeoff, snoring loudly. Maya lay nearby in a seat they'd reclined to dorm a bed. Father Anthony and I flew coach if we flew at all, I said. Usually we drove. He scoffed. I suppose you think yourself superior because of your humility? I never said any such thing, I said, but he was right. You didn't need to, he said with a sneer. He cracked his knuckles and then scratched furiously at the back of his head. You only reveal your own ignorance. We, the Knights of St. Michael, are the very sword of God. One does not enter the battlefield on bended knee, supplicating to his opponent. He comes out in armor of gold, wielding a sword of fire, striking fear into the hearts of the demons. Now it was my turn to laugh. So the leather seats, that's the modern-day equivalent of a flaming sword? I'm sure they terrify the devil. Father Anselmo stood and stretched. He itched at his scalp again furiously. I read about you on the way over, he said. A convert, widowed. You wear the robes, but you're different than those of us who grew up in the faith, who never knew a woman's touch. Before I'd been slightly annoyed at Father Anselmo. Now at the mention of my wife, I felt my blood rising. God comes to us all at different times, I said quietly, but my hands were balled into fists. Save it for the flock, he said. We're all priests here. We should speak honestly. You and I, we're not the same. When my wife was in high school, she had a terrible boyfriend. He was an honor student and a top athlete, popular, beloved. No one would have suspected the pain he inflicted on her in private. Even when we started dating, 10 years later, she couldn't describe what he'd done to her physically, in the dark of night one summer alone in his family's cabin. No one for miles around, a fact he whispered to her over and over. All she would say is that a few days later, after praying the pain would go away on its own, that she'd driven herself to the doctor, who gave her stitches and promised not to tell her parents. Somehow, even after what he'd done, she couldn't break up with him. They continued dating through prom, even into the summer after senior year. She tried not to be alone with him, but it was futile. He hurt her again and again. When they finally broke up, there was no big confrontation. It was just the standard ending, where they both went to college and drifted apart, eventually realizing they were no longer a couple. When they saw each other on holiday breaks, they acted friendly, even though his presence was enough to send her into a panic. After hearing the story, It occurred to me that I might have a moral obligation to find this man and hurt him as badly as he'd hurt her. Maybe to kill him, partly to spare any future women he might date from a similar fate. But if I'm being honest, it was mostly pure revenge. Naturally, Sophia was utterly opposed. Maybe she wanted to protect me from the consequences of such a thing. More likely, she knew I wouldn't have a chance against him. He'd been an all-state wrestler and outweighed me by 20 pounds. Eventually, we came to a kind of agreement. I wouldn't seek the man out, but if I ever happened to bump into him, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. For many years, whenever we visited her hometown, I felt a surge of adrenaline anytime a man matching his description walked in the door of a restaurant. "Is that him?" I'd ask, and she'd shake her head no. Gradually, we visited Sophia's hometown less often. I never did see the man in person. As far as I know, I'd still have her permission to kill him if I ever bumped into him. "You're right," I told Anselmo after a moment. "We're not the same. And since we're going to be honest, maybe you'd be a better priest if you'd had a couple of rolls in the hay before you put on your collar. Even just to know us sinners a little better." Nah. He was scratching harder than ever at the back of his head now. "We're not the same," he was shouting now, so loud that Father Thomas began to stir in his seat. "You didn't deserve to capture a lieutenant of hell. You got lucky. You weren't even properly trained. You just finished one last stitch. You're not even a real priest." He practically roared the last word. It had a strange echo, like it had been harmonized by two voices at once. As he spoke, he tore at the back of his skull again, and this time I heard a ripping sound like flesh unzipping in two. Blood began to accumulate on his shoulders. "Father Anselmo," said Father Thomas quietly, fully awake now, "please step to the side of the plane. Kneel. Fold your hands in prayer." "I'll do no such thing, you meat-headed fuck," shouted Anselmo. It was clear that two voices were speaking in unison now, his and another deeper one emanating from the back of his skull. Suddenly, without warning, two things happened. Father Thomas began to say a Hail Mary in the original Latin, so fast that the words flowed together in a steady hum. Second, he pelted Father Anselmo with a jar of holy water that exploded as it collided with his chest, sending fragments of pottery and liquid everywhere. "Behind me!" he shouted between recitations. I stepped back. As I did, the plane shook and I nearly fell. The sky had been cloudless when we took off from LA. Now dark thunderheads had gathered outside, blotting out the sun and pelting the small windows with rain. Father Anselmo had taken a step back after absorbing the force of the water jar. He also turned 180 degrees, revealing his back to us. There, I saw a bloody face no bigger than a baby's skull protruding just above where his neck met his hairline. The baby's contorted mouth shouted every syllable as Father Anselmo screamed, "There's nowhere to run to, priest! You're trapped up here with me now. This time, you're mine." "Bifrons the Two-Faced," said Father Thomas. "I thought I recognized your—" Before he could say another word, Father Anselmo Bifrons now charged at him. I realized that in addition to the tiny head, he'd sprouted an extra set of arms and legs, which extended from his elbows and knees and had now grown almost as large as the original ones. The fresh limbs were bare and bloody, glossed with a sheen of mucus like a newborn baby. Bifrons fell on Father Thomas with his full weight, beating at him with the bloody limbs and biting at his face with his fast-growing new head. But Father Thomas had been prepared. Pushing Anselmo to the side with one hand, he took a small silver blade in the other and stabbed it to the hilt into the baby head's right eye. The baby screamed a low growl that seemed to shake the very air inside the plane, and the aircraft dipped again, this time by 100 feet or more, tossing us all off our feet. When I looked back at Father Thomas, his forehead was bleeding from falling against the edge of a chair. Ignoring the injury, he dug into his bag and removed 3 more knives. "Demon of greed," he said, gesturing to the demon. "Bifrons, we can contain him if we seal all 4 eyes. Try to stay back. Let me work." Even as he said it, though, I could see him wobbling on his feet. He touched his forehead and the blood was gushing now. "Bad luck, Father Thomas," said Bifrons. "I suspect our next little conversation will be in my place." He charged at Father Thomas again, but the priest was ready. Deftly, he stabbed 2 knives into the eyes that had once been Anselmo's. The demon howled in pain, so loud that my ears began to ring, and I fell to my knees. Outside, the clouds had fully blotted out the sun. Everything seemed to be shaking. I wondered if we were falling into the deep Black Sea. Tomas fell back now, his head thwapping the ground with an unpleasant crack. He didn't open his eyes. Across the plain, the demon rose, fixing me in its one remaining eye. The lights shorted in the plane and the engines went silent. Everything was black, save for the occasional flash of lightning. It seemed to me that I was about to die, or that perhaps I already had. Perhaps the rest of my existence would be like this, surrounded by darkness with the constant feeling of falling, a demon laughing a few feet away. Of course, fear gnawed at me, like a family of mice nibbling at my guts. But could I be blamed? Wouldn't anyone be afraid in such a moment? "Bad luck for you both," said the thing. "At least you'll finally be able to visit your dear wife again. Sophia, isn't it? I hear she's been missing you greatly." At the mention of Sophia's name, reality snapped back to focus. It was as if the plane was holding in midair. Gravity felt somehow lighter. I got to my feet, my fear replaced with simple, blind rage. Suddenly, the thing in front of me wasn't Bifron. It was Sophia's ex. I reached forward and uncurled the final blade from Father Thomas's limp, bloody fingers. "I told you not to talk about my wife," I said. I could feel her there with me again. Silently, I asked if our deal was still on, if I could still kill him. I can't be sure, but I think I heard her whisper, yes. Now it was my turn to charge forward. My vision narrowed. Through the darkness, all I saw was the one cruel white eye staring at me. I thought of my wife. Then I drove the blade home. On the tarmac in Rome, a man with red robes was waiting for us. I recognized him from a pamphlet I'd once read as Cardinal Robles. He reacted little as he surveyed the bloody scene. The pilot still hadn't left the cockpit. I suspected it was some sort of protocol. Father Thomas lay in my lap, his head bound with a pillowcase I'd fashioned into a makeshift bandage. Both Maya and Anselmo's bodies lay peacefully on the floor, her mouth sealed with thread, his eyes with daggers. After a moment, the Cardinal began to laugh. "You'll have to forgive me, Father Matthew," he said. "It's not often that I send my men out to capture one demon, and they come back with two." I coughed up a bit of blood. I wondered when I'd been injured. I didn't feel like laughing. "Enough," he said. "I think we'd better get these two back home before a third one shows up. What do you say?" I nodded weakly. "We'll get these two to their new accommodations, and then we're going to have a nice long chat," said the Cardinal. "I'm starting to think that St. Michael has big plans for you." I squirmed uncomfortably in the ancient stool, its uneven padding forcing me to sit at a slant. In retrospect, I'm sure Cardinal Robles chose it on purpose. He wanted to see me as uncomfortable as possible, all part of the test. Of course, I was nervous already. As intended, the Grand Chapel's ceiling soaring above us made me feel small. 66 feet above us, God reached out to Adam, granting him life. The metaphor was obvious. I was Adam waiting for my prize. But what was the Cardinal about to give me? The old man fixed me in his gaze. "What do you know about hell?" he asked after a few moments. I thought back to my training. "Hell is the absence of God," I answered carefully. He smirked. "Good. Cautious answer. We like caution here. Sometimes. Other times we prefer cojones." He started laughing as if he'd just made some kind of outrageous joke. The Cardinal had grown up on the streets of Montevideo in Uruguay. He had a reputation for crude jokes. Some people called him direct. Others called him an asshole. I suppose he was both. "Let me rephrase," he said. "Suppose I were to ask you the geography of hell. Could you draw me a map? Could you describe its mountains, its swamps?" I shook my head. "I have never thought of it as a physical place," I answered, still careful. "Of course not," he said. "But you're not so stupid as to deny the connection between the physical and spiritual, correct? Take your little altercation in Los Angeles. You sewed the girl's lips shut, correct? But if that's all you did, there would have been no effect. You were able to quell the demon's hunger because the sewing of the mouth had a metaphorical, spiritual equivalent. Same with the demon's eyes on the plane. Think of Matthew 18:9, And if thine eye causeth thee to stumble, pluck it out and cast it from thee. It is good for thee to enter into life with one eye, rather than having two eyes to be cast into the hell of fire. Now I'm a bit lost, I confessed. The cardinal rubbed at his temples, clearly disappointed. Let's try this one more time. Stop being so goddamn careful, or I'm sending you back to the States to study under Father David. I shuddered at the thought. Father David was a notorious coward, a priest only fit to deal with minor exorcisms. He had called the Vatican for assistance so many times on major ones that he'd earned the name Father Backup amongst his peers. Those things you sealed, where do you think they live? Think back to Maya Knowles' house. I closed my eyes and thought back to the house where I'd sewn Maya Knowles' lips shut. I had spent every hour since then trying to block out the smell of blood and colon, the thickness of the air. Suddenly, I found I was speaking, almost without trying. A swamp, I said. Thick mud. Shit raining from the sky. The cardinal's eyes lit up. Yes, yes, more. Someone always screaming. Animal sounds. The air is freezing. There's a constant hail pelting the burning mud. Yes, he shouted, and then he began to recite. In the third circle I arrive of showers, ceaseless, accursed, heavy and cold, unchanged, forever, both in kind and in degree. Large hail, discolored water, sleety flaw. Through the dun midnight air streamed down amain, stank all the land whereon that tempest fell. I struggled to remember where he was quoting from. Certainly not the Bible this time. Inferno, he said after a moment, looking disappointed. You're not a literary man? I studied engineering in college, I said. More of a math brain. I do remember something about Dante being non-canonical. He rubbed his temples again. There was something exaggerated about his movements, like Donald Duck losing his cool in an old cartoon. There are truths in this world that are better kept secret, he said. The church must act as a shield sometimes, you know, guarding the flock from the fiery darts of the wicked. And so it is with us exorcists. I looked up at him, slightly confused. I wasn't aware that you were an exorcist yourself? I mean, you're a cardinal. He started laughing. There's a lot you don't know. He stood, stretching slightly. Then he began to lift the hem of his robe. I looked down to see a deep scar running from his ankle to his knee. Got that one from a demon of violence named Toru. Everyone was sure I'd lose the leg below the knee. Doctors are idiots, of course. He raised the robe further and turned from me, exposing 4 parallel scars across his back. Those are from Mammon himself, demon of greed. He got away from me, but not before he left me this little souvenir. He paused, looking up at the ceiling, up at God. They're demons, you understand. They're different than the minor entities responsible for most possessions. Even what the church calls a major exorcism is really just the minor leagues compared to what we handle. These demons I'm talking about, they are the lords and lieutenants of hell, professional soldiers for the other side. More exorcists will never encounter one over the course of a whole career. The thing that was inside Maya Knowles, I started to say, was Lady of Hell, a demon of gluttony. Quite powerful. Really, you shouldn't be here today. If things had gone according to the demon's plan, she would have eaten you too and then consumed her own host body like an Ouroboros, breaking her own arms and legs and swallowing them whole. I was beginning to feel sick, and if I'm going to be honest, I was afraid. Everything I'd known about demons up to that point was suddenly invalid. I thought I'd been a soldier for the church, but now I realized I was playing parlor games with hell's second stringers. Were the things that had taken Maya and Anselmo the worst things out there? Or were there even worse horrors to be discovered? Why are you telling me all this? He smacked his head and muttered, Dios mío. Then he looked up at me. Isn't it obvious? He finally asked. I want to know if you want in. If you want to play in the major leagues, mijo. Do you want to fight some real demons with us? Or do you want to go back to sprinkling holy water on little shits pretending to be possessed so that they can get more attention from mama? I thought of the demons slurping Father Anthony's guys through the tiny hole at the side of its mouth. I thought of the baby head sprouting from Father Anselmo's neck, its deep, guttural laugh. I thought of the foul air, the smell of shit. Cardinal Robles held up a hand. Don't answer yet, he said. It's enough to know you're considering it. Before your answer, you need to see the reality of what we're up against. He swept his arm out with a flourish. Follow me. Asterisk. Do you believe in God? Any kind of God? I looked up at Sophia. It was a bold question for a second date, but she was asking it anyway. Even before I'd asked her out, I'd known Sophia was religious. Not that she was a fanatic or anything, but she went to church most Sundays, which was unusual in our social group. I shrugged, hoping we could deal with the question quickly and move on to another topic. I think at some point I decided it was one of those big questions that you could never answer. So I stopped asking. I try to spend my time on problems that have solutions. She silently ate a few forkfuls of her salad. I'm assuming you do, I said, trying to break the awkward silence. Believe, I mean. Well, I don't believe in God, she said after a bit. Believe implies there'd be a possibility of doubt. I know there's a God because I know there are demons. I've seen them at work. I topped off my wine and took a drink. This was getting interesting. What do you mean, seen them? This is going to sound crazy, so I'll understand if you get up from the table after a bit and walk out on me. I won't be offended at all. We can still be friends after. I met her eyes. They were deadly serious. I'm not going to do that, I said. You can tell me. Now it was her turn to take a long drink. When I was younger, 4th grade, I was possessed for a few months, she said. I almost spit out my wine. I know how it sounds, she continued. I used to be embarrassed to tell people. But it's part of who I am. There was a demon living inside me. It pushed me to a dark little bubble that I didn't know existed. It was terrifying, watching her through a black haze, saying the most vile things to my parents, my sister. I'd always been a good kid. At least that's what I thought. But I must have let her in somehow. She was crying now. For a second, I wondered if I was on a date with an insane person. But when I looked at her, she didn't seem even the least bit crazy. I reached out and took her hand. I'm so sorry, I said. It's okay, she said. The church, they sent people. Exorcists. It turned out to be something minor, they said. It didn't feel minor to me. But their prayers made it go away. I'm sorry, I said again. What else could I say? Don't be, she said. It was a gift. After that, I didn't have to believe anymore. I knew there was something out there. A bad thing and a good thing. I've gotten to carry that with me every day of my life. Asterisk. I followed Cardinal Robles through a series of rooms and doors, each less grand than the last. Gone were the frescoes and magnificent tapestries. Instead, we weaved through corridors of simple brick. I realized that the architecture, too, was growing simpler, older. The brickwork was uneven, caked with centuries of grime. The air began to grow cold. Without realizing it, I recognized that we'd been walking slowly downward. There were no windows here or even electric light, just large candles inset into the walls. Of course, everyone knows about the grandeur of the current apostolic palace. But like many things in life, truths lurk beneath the surface that most people never realize. Some of these bricks you're seeing now go all the way back to the 4th century. This was all part of the old St. Peter's Basilica, constructed by Constantine I. He was a convert like you know. The path we followed was winding and haphazard. Without the cardinal there, I wondered if I'd be able to retrace my steps and escape. Escape? That word started to echo in my mind. I realized I didn't like it here. I hated it. Wanted to get out at any cost, back to the light, the murals, God, and Adam. Then something shifted in me. Somewhere, not too far away, I felt her presence. It was unmistakably Sophia, as if she'd just walked behind me in the hall. I turned, sure I'd seen her, but she was gone. It was enough to make me keep walking forward. Finally, we came to a door. Beyond this door is no return, said the Cardinal after a few moments. Even if you choose not to join us, you will have seen things beyond your imagining, beyond the worst descriptions of Dante or even Revelation. For a moment, I only stared at the door handle. It looked ornate and ancient. filthy from the grime of 1,000 hands of 1,000 priests. Beyond it, I heard something that sounded like the clanking of metal on metal. "Go ahead," said the Cardinal. "Open it." I took a step back in revulsion, but when I looked again, I saw now a handle, but a woman's hand, soft and welcoming. I knew who it belonged to, saw the familiar wedding band on the ring finger. I knew somehow that if I went forward, I was moving closer to her. I walked forward and opened the door. We entered a room built of ancient stones. It was perhaps as large as a high school gymnasium, but perfectly round, with many doors extending in all directions. To one side sat a man in priest's robes and a thick leather apron. Nearby, a cauldron of molten silver sat over a roaring fire. As I watched, the priest said a blessing over the silver, then poured it into a large cross-shaped mold. Soon he was pounding on the surface. Beside him, in neat stacks, lay perhaps 100 such crosses, all neatly stacked. "Why so many?" I asked the Cardinal, who only smirked. "You'll soon see." He gestured to the blacksmith, who set aside his hammer for a moment. "Where are the new prisoners?" "Or just the girl, actually," asked the Cardinal, and the man gestured silently to one of the doors, adorned with gold inlay and flanked by small silver gargoyles. The man resumed his work as we walked to the door and opened it. On the other side, I found out what the crosses were for. In the center of a small, dimly lit room lay a cage. More of a box, really, a 6-foot cube. The whole thing had been built of silver cross, all elaborately connected to form an inescapable grid. Inside lay Maya Knowles. Her eyes were no longer closed, but the stitching still ran across her lips. Both of her wrists were manacled in bracers connected on opposite sides of the cage by silver chains. I gave the Cardinal a curious look. "This is like no exorcism I've ever seen," I said. He shook his head. "You misunderstand, Father," he said. "This is no longer an exorcism. Maya and whoever has infested her will be here as our permanent guests, unable to cause further mischief in the world." I felt something twist in my stomach. "You have to let her go," I said quietly. "I can get the thing out of her. Together, we—" The Cardinal shook his head. "You could kill her," he said. "Release her that way. But there is no saving Maya Knowles' mortal life, which is why she'll be our guest here for as long as she lives. For as long as the demon is trapped within Maya's mortal coil, it will be unable to hurt another soul." "You can't," I said. "Maya, she's still in there. She's an innocent. Were she truly innocent, the demon would have never infested her," said the Cardinal. "Please understand, I know this is a lot to swallow. This is why we work in the basement out of the light. What we do here takes moral courage, the same bravery that Abraham possessed when he stood over Isaac, dagger in hand. Thanks to Maya's sacrifice, dozens of others, possibly hundreds, will be spared a similar fate. She is the true cage, the box of silver crosses that just keeps her in place." As he spoke, Maya looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "It's her," I said. "Right now it's her, not the demon. It led her to the surface. She's experiencing all of this." "Of course," said the Cardinal. "The demon loves to hide inside. It loves to let her suffer." "Maya can't eat like that," I said. "Can't drink. She won't live long." The Cardinal shook his head. "You still don't understand the powers we're facing. With demons of this strength, these lieutenants of hell, the possessed body is essentially immortal. It has no need for sustenance. Maya will still be here long after you and I are both dust." I wanted to fall to my knees and vomit. The Cardinal was staring at me hard, trying to read my reaction. "Do you need a drink?" he asked. "Water? Wine?" I found I could barely speak. He shook his head, looking disappointed. "Do what you must," he whispered. "I never claimed it was easy to be a soldier on the front lines." I ignored him and took a step toward Maya. Then suddenly, something compelled me to run to her. I felt around the cage of silver crosses, searching for a hinge that would open or a weak spot on in the soldering. "Step away!" shouted Cardinal Robles. He was keeping his distance from both of us. "You still don't know what you're dealing with, and those restraints aren't built to be permanent." Before he'd even finished his sentence, I heard a horrible cracking sound, and I looked over to see Maya's wrenching her arm against one of the bracers. The arm had clearly broken, and now blood was gushing freely from the places where her bone had pierced her flesh. Quickly, she pulled the broken limb from the bracer and swung her limp forearm in my direction, spraying me with blood. The blood splattered across my face, running down my lips and into my mouth, and I was struck by the sensation that I'd ingested poison. "Drink up, priest!" the thing inside her shouted before breaking into peals of laughter. I looked around the room looking for some kind of weapon. I was filled suddenly with a bloodlust like I'd never known. "Step back!" shouted Cardinal Robles again. This time he grabbed my collar and pulled hard. He was far stronger than he looked, and I found myself clattering against the ground. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose, frustrated. The demon was laughing now at me, I realized. "This is your new soldier, Robles?" it asked. "He'll be dead before the week is out." As she spoke, blood continued to pour from her open wound. Seeing my eyes fixed on it, she tried to swing it at me again. But this time, I was too far away for the blood to hit me. My stomach turned. If I'm going to be honest, I almost pissed myself. In that moment, I realized I couldn't be in the room another second. My instincts took over. I had to leave. The demon cackled as the fear took over, and I ran. "Go if you like," called Cardinal Robles, "but you can't run from the devil." I was more terrified than I'd ever been in my life, if I'm being honest. Not just of the thing in Maya, but of the cardinal outside the cage, of the whole new reality I'd stumbled into. I ran back to the room with dozens of doors to find the blacksmith back at his work, smoothing out another silver cross. I tried to remember which door I'd come from in the first place, but they all looked basically the same. I walked the circle, fruitlessly searching for some identifying mark, but came up empty. Finally, I just opened one. On the other side was a dark tunnel leading downward. A waft of sulfur hit my nostrils, blowing on a hot wind. I was immediately struck by the certainty that I'd opened a doorway to hell itself. I was about to close it when I heard a voice calling for me. "Matthew," it said. "Is that you? I've been waiting for so long, calling to you, trying to bring you here." I could barely speak. My throat went dry, my vision blurred. Somehow I still managed to speak her name. "Sophia? Want to know the rest of the story? Let me know!" Thank you for watching the video fully. Please hit the like and subscribe button, since I could not make these videos without your support, and it means the world to me.